I was born to help. I'm the last person to hurt your child. Just know that from my heart. Deal with it how you gonna deal with it from there. Hate me, can never speak to me a day from this. But both families will tell you, I looked at them eye to eye, man to man, and told them straight up, no. Violence? Hell no.
Ray Lewis is a Hall of Fame linebacker. He spent his entire 17-year career with the Baltimore Ravens. He has 2 Super Bowl trophies, a Super Bowl MVP award, 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, 13 Pro Bowls. He holds the record for the most tackles of all time, and he also holds the record for the most tackles in a single season with 156. And he's got a really cool, iconic dance move called the squirrel dance, where he would come out of the tunnel and gyrate and squawk like a raven. For some reason, no idea why, but who cares? It was awesome. But despite being one of the best players in the history of the NFL, so many people in the football world still label him as a murderer. They think he's kind of like an OJ type who just is really charismatic, but there's some darkness behind him, and he definitely got away with murder because he's rich and famous. So the question is, did Ray Lewis actually have something to do with the murder of 2 young men back in 2000? The answer is complex. So here's what happened. It was January 31st, 2000. The St. Louis Rams had just beaten the Tennessee Titans in the Super Bowl in Atlanta, which resulted in one of the most iconic plays in NFL history.
Probably the final play of the game in regulation. It is caught by Dyson. Can he get in? No, he cannot. Mike Jones made the tackle, and the Rams have won the Super Bowl.
Ray Lewis and his entourage were in town for the game that night, and afterwards they went out to party and celebrate and attend a bunch of really high-profile parties. Around midnight, Ray and his friends, led by Reginald Oakley and Joseph Sweeting, went to this place called the Cobalt Lounge. Now, this is a really luxurious, upscale nightclub in Atlanta that a lot of athletes and celebrities attended. So this is a really nice place. They were dressed in mink coats. They had ladies on their arm. They were drinking 200 bottles of champagne. They were really feeling themselves. Another group, led by Jacinth Baker and Richard Lollar, approached Ray's entourage and started talking trash, essentially. Now, there are conflicting reports on what happened next. It's a little murky and inconsistent, but basically they were talking about wealth and status and, just peacocking, basically. Around 4 a.m., a fight broke out between Ray's friends and their friends. It was a huge street fight. There were reports of knives and bottles and punching, and unfortunately that led to the death of Jacinth and Richard. Later on that morning, Ray and his buddies Reginald and Joseph were arrested. Jacinth and Richard were childhood friends from Akron, Ohio. Now, Akron at the time especially was a place that was riddled with drugs and violence and just a lot of crime. And these 2 friends were trying to get away from all of that, so they moved to Atlanta to essentially restart their lives. Jacinth was essentially a starving artist trying to make it in a bigger city. At the time of his death, he was wanted for a couple of misdemeanors in cocaine possession and driving with an open container of booze, and he'd previously been found guilty on a misdemeanor of improperly handing a firearm. Richard was a barber, and he had picked up a couple of weed possessions in Akron, and he had a fiance and a baby that was due in about a month, so he had real incentive to get away from where he was from. Now, on the defense side, Joseph Sweeting was a music producer and a longtime friend of Ray from back when Ray was playing football at the University of Miami. Joseph was also known as Kilo Ump, and he was a big part of this drug organization called the Miami Boys, which distributed a lot of cocaine and heroin all throughout Miami and Atlanta in the 80s and the 90s. Reginald was a newer friend of Ray. He was also a barber, like Richard, and he was just a normal working class guy. Then there's Ray. At the time, he was already a superstar in the NFL. He had just finished up his 4th year, he had already been to 3 Pro Bowls, and he had just signed a 4-year, $26 million deal with the Baltimore Ravens. At the time, that was one of the biggest contracts in NFL history. He was basically getting paid quarterback money to play linebacker. That is how good he was. He was phenomenal. Ray also grew up in a very tough neighborhood. He didn't have a dad growing up, and he witnessed a lot of drug-related violence and crime, and he finally made it out of that, and when he did, like a lot of NFL players do, he took care of his family. He was financially providing for a lot of his family members, a lot of his friends, and he just had so much to lose, as did a lot of people in his family and his circle. And that played a huge part in how all of this went down. In the years since the trial in 2000, there have been multiple things that have come out about Ray that have really rubbed people the wrong way. There's a lot of unproven facts and conspiracy theories about this case as well. We're just going to avoid all of those. I'm going to stick with official court documents and things that have come out of Ray's own mouth, starting with his 2015 book, where he said, "I was dressed out. I had my jewelry on, my fine mink coat. I wasn't about to start mixing it up looking like that," which, I don't know. It came off a little O.J. Simpson-y. He could have made up his own quote, like "If I had my mink coat on, I did no wrong," you know? And violence doesn't have a dress code. I don't think John Wayne Gacy was ever sitting there like, "Ah, shit, I've got my three-piece Tom Ford on. Ugh, here, get out of the car." That just didn't happen. Ray also claimed in the book that he didn't even know that the murders even happened until they got back to the hotel room. Now, I looked into it. This hotel was 10 minutes away from the Cobalt Lounge. I find it personally hard to believe that nobody said anything for 10 minutes about murder. I just find that to be a little suspect. And then in an interview with Shannon Sharp and CBS, Ray said some things that were strange. They were just very odd.
But the saddest thing ever was that a man looked me in my face and told me, "We know you didn't do this, but you going down for it anyway."
I think we can all agree that it's a little insensitive to say that's the saddest part of this entire thing, when two people died. Now, the second thing in the interview he said was another reason that he gave for not being the murderer.
The way God works, he don't use people who commits anything like that.
Number one, it is possible that a believer is capable of murder. I don't buy that at all. And number two, he clearly hasn't read the Bible, because God does use murderers. He does it a lot. There were also a couple of things that came out during trial where Ray confirmed that his buddies, Reginald and Joseph, purchased knives a day before the murders happened. And it was also confirmed that they sped away seconds after the murder happened, which is a big reason why they were arrested in the first place. Then in 2003, roughly 3 years later after the murder trial, the family of Jacinth Baker filed a wrongful death civil lawsuit. They were trying to seek money for the damages and the legal fees. In official court documents filed by Jacinth Baker's attorney, they claimed that Ray Lewis was with a woman named Jessica LaRose Robertson at the time of the murder. The document also stated that Ray paid off his mother, Sensaria Keith, to dispose of the suit that he was wearing at the night of the murder. Ray's attorneys didn't even refute that evidence. Instead, they said that plaintiff has brought forth a great deal of evidence that is immaterial to any issue currently before the court. Now, they could have just said this because they knew if they refuted it, they would inevitably have to defend themselves in court over the claim, or else they would start to look worse, but just to blaze on past it was kind of odd. From this civil lawsuit, Ray actually agreed to settle and paid the family of Jacinth Baker an undisclosed amount of money, and then a year later he did the same thing with Richard Lollar and his family when they filed a civil lawsuit. In his 2015 book, Ray talked about these civil lawsuits and explained that he did it out of sympathy and love and not guilt, which, you know? So when you look at all of these things and you put them all together, it does sound like he is pretty guilty. But this case is precisely why you keep reading before you bring out the pitchforks. 11 days after the murder, Ray, Reginald, and Joseph were all indicted for murder, which is extremely fast for a case, especially one like this. So each side had to put together their teams very, very quickly. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Paul Howard, who exercised his right to take on any case he wants. So he did it, even though he didn't have trial experience for the past 4 years. He hadn't been on trial in 4 years, but he did it anyway. He publicly stated that he did this to save his assistants from a very complex case. He tried to play the hero, but in reality, his intentions were a lot different, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Now to the defense. Ray's team was led by Ed Garland and Don Samuel, and Reginald and Joseph were represented by Bruce Harvey and Steve Sado. This defense was made up of the best lawyers in all of Georgia. They were wealthy, they were smart, and they were very experienced. Now each team had very different styles of approach. The prosecution came out of the gate swinging with every promise in the world. They said that they were going to put away Ray because he was guilty, and they were going to prove it. The defense knew that the prosecution did not have nearly as much as they were claiming to have in the newspapers. So their whole strategy was just don't admit to anything that you don't have to, and cross-examine their witnesses in court. And I think the main reason why the defense thought that the prosecution didn't have anything is what happened just days before the trial began. The prosecution met with Ray Lewis and offered him a plea deal, a 3-year prison sentence in exchange for him pleading guilty to aggravated assault and testifying against his friends Reginald and Joseph. Ray declined, and he made them all go to trial, and that just made this entire thing way more complex. So the prosecution was forced to go on with what they had, which was not much. This was a case that was based on a lot of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Because of that, they based their entire case on witnesses, starting with Dwayne Fassett. He was the limo driver that night. In his original statement with the police, he claimed that he saw Ray punching a guy. But later, during the trial, he claimed that he lied, and claimed that he only said that because the police pressured him into saying it. Another witness was Jeff Gwynn. He was a friend of one of the victims, and he originally claimed that he saw Ray beating the tar out of Richard Lollar, but later retracted his statement in the trial and said that he only saw him wrestling with some people and trying to break up the fight. During the trial, he also claimed that he saw a man with a knife, which matched the descriptions of Kwame King and Carlos Stafford, who were also friends of Ray. The defense very brilliantly said out loud during the cross-examination that the prosecution did not let them in on this new piece of information, and that just really pissed off the judge, and it made them look not trustworthy in the jury's eyes. Another witness and a friend of the victims, Chris Shinholster, didn't even flip-flop. He just flat out said that the defendants did not match the person who had the knife. And then they brought out Chester Anderson. This guy was a professional con man. He was a liar, and he originally said in his statement that he saw Ray hitting somebody, and then during cross-examination, the defense questioned him, and they exposed all of the holes in his story and proved that he was a liar. So at this point, everything was going right for the defense. And then Ray did something that nobody saw coming. After 3 weeks of trial, the prosecutors were honestly desperate, so they met with Ray privately and discussed a plea deal. They would only charge him with a misdemeanor of obstruction of justice, not murder. Ray took the deal, which shocked his friends' lawyers and his friends because they thought this thing was done. There was no need for this. But Ray's goal was to get back to playing football as quickly as possible and get back to his big new contract that he just signed, and this was the quickest way to do that. So he testified against Reginald and Joseph, and he didn't directly implicate them in the murder, but he did damage Joseph a little bit. He said that 2 guys from the other group jumped Reginald and Joseph from behind with broken bottles. He claimed that Joseph admitted to retaliating, and he said that he had demonstrated punches to him with a closed fist that contained a knife inside of it. But he never directly implicated his friends in the murder because he said he didn't actually see what happened. He just really made it seem like they were jumped, and if anything, his comments about Joseph implied that he might have defended himself. So the trial ended. Reginald Oakley and Joseph Sweeting were found not guilty of murder, and Ray only got a misdemeanor. The city could not put any of them away, and they couldn't put Ray away. And it wasn't until after the trial when people really got to see just how crooked the whole prosecuting team was. Now, most people would have questions about this trial, specifically about the prosecution. Why rush an indictment? Why would you take on a case after not being on trial for 4 years? Why did this whole thing seem so disorganized and rushed? Well, for the district attorney, Paul Howard, and Mayor Bill Campbell, this was a re-election year. Atlanta was known as a hotbed for crime, and they wanted to put somebody down. They want to get all 3 of them, or at least one of them, to prove to everyone that they're not going to tolerate something like this and score political points. And I mentioned this earlier, but Paul Howard painted himself out to be kind of a martyr for his peers. He originally said publicly that he took this case on to cover for his assistants and not let them take on such a complex case, but in reality, it was all a political move. This was a huge opportunity for him. It was a huge chance for him to get reelected because this is a very high-profile case. He's taking on somebody who is very rich and famous, and if he could get a quick conviction, if he could put Ray away, or if he could put one of these guys away, a lot of publicity, a lot of press, you can be all over the newspaper. Huge opportunity. In the days after the incident, there were 2 huge things that Paul and the city did that really pressed the murderer label on Ray's forehead. Immediately after the killings, Paul and Mayor Bill Campbell held a big news conference, and the first 2 things that came out of their mouths were that Mr. Lewis is an active participant in this crime, and that these 3 friends were literally dripping with blood. They said these things knowing full well that they didn't have jack shit on them. And we know this now because of everything that happened at trial. All these witnesses were all over the place. They did this because it's sensationalized, because it looked good on the front page of the newspaper. That is the only reason why they did it. It was purely a political move. Once this case was actually investigated, the detectives, the prosecution, the defense, the witnesses, every single group across the board said that Ray had nothing to do with this, and he was only trying to break the fights up. That's it. Even Ken Allen, the lead detective in the case, later said said in a 2017 interview, "I don't think Ray Lewis killed anybody." Back in 2000, Paul said that if he hadn't brought the indictment, this case would have never gotten solved. He also claimed that he only indicted Ray because of Dwayne Fassett's comments, which, yes, he was very flip-floppy and all over the place, but in his original statement, he only said that he saw Ray punching somebody. He never said that he saw him stabbing or anything. He only said that about his friends. And yet, Paul Howard still indicted him for murder, knowing all of these things. This was purely a strategy to try and get Ray to flip sides, which he did. Paul knew from the jump that Ray had nothing to do with this, and he still intentionally smeared his character and his image. Everything that they did from the start of this case is the reason why so many people still think that Ray is the killer. So I spent a lot of time reviewing the case, and this is my new channel, and I have a lot of opinions, so I'm going to say them. I don't think he did it, but I think he made a lot of really, really stupid decisions that followed it. I think he knew very quickly who did it. I think he tried to deflect blame, and I think he actively threw the police off the trail of what actually happened. I also think that he knew the kind of people he was hanging around. He knew that they had knives, he knew that they did something, and he didn't do enough to help. He also allowed the limo driver to drive off and leave those two men to die. Now the question is why? Because who knows? I mean, it could be he was just trying to protect his friends. He could have been scared of the police, scared that they would try to pin this on him for being a rich, famous black man in America. Very reasonable. It could have been both of those things. I don't know. This was an era before DNA became a thing. This was very common for police back in this era to pin things on a guy who was a certain color or race. They would do that, and I'm sure that was in the back of his mind. But I don't think he did enough to help the case, and he knows it, and I think that's why he settled back in 2003, because he knows he actually is guilty of something. But I also have a hard time looking down on Ray. I've never experienced anything remotely close to that. You know, it's easy for me to sit here in my little office and film a YouTube video and judge somebody, but it's not easy to sit there and watch two men die right in front of you and then just know how to handle it when you're a young man yourself. I mean, this guy's early 20s. He also has a lot of people who depend on him. This is a man who has come from extreme poverty, who grew up with an absent father and around a lot of the same elements that the two victims did. And he made it out very recently. He had only been in the NFL for a few years at this point, and he had friends and family that he was financially taking care of. I'm sure he was weighing all of that. And it's not easy to rat your friends out, you know, so I can't imagine how difficult of a situation that this would be. And I'm also a big believer in the idea that somebody can rehabilitate their life. Ray Lewis has not been in criminal trouble ever since this incident, and he became one of the most charitable players in the history of the NFL. But I can also see why people still think he's guilty, because there were just a lot of comments that came out after everything happened, especially in his 2015 book, interviews that came out afterwards, that he just seemed insensitive. But I can also see why these families have not forgiven him either. And they have not forgiven him, because I don't know that level of pain. I hope to God I never do. I can't even fathom that level of pain. It's just sitting on that for 25 years and trying your best to forgive somebody and to get over something like that. I have no idea. And I know this isn't a definitive answer, but this is a complex case, and there's just so many different emotions, and it's just impossible to sit here and be like, this is what happened. This is 100%. But anyway, let me know what you think. I'm very curious what you guys believe based on everything that I presented, and feel free to stick around. Please subscribe. This is my first video on this channel. I post a lot of different content on other channels, like running through a public park with gigantic red flags and green flags, but the NFL is my special interest. This is the only sport that I watch and keep up with, and I would love to keep covering wild stories like this and talk about football with you all. I hope you stick around. All right, toodles.